There was a time in Western Kenya when a single sentence could tell an entire story. No one announced it. No one whispered in embarrassment. Instead, someone would quietly say, "She has gone to the moon." Everyone understood. Children heard the words long before they understood their meaning. Young women learned them as part of growing up. Elders spoke them naturally, without awkwardness or shame. It was a phrase that moved through generations so effortlessly that few stopped to ask where it came from. But hidden inside those 5 simple words was an entire way of seeing the human body. Today, most people hear a phrase like "going to the moon" and assume it must belong to folklore or superstition. After all, what could the moon possibly have to do with menstruation? Yet the more historians, anthropologists, and linguists study indigenous African knowledge systems, the more they discover that expressions like these were rarely accidental. They often carried generations of careful observation, encoded in language that was poetic enough to remember, but practical enough to use in everyday life. What if our ancestors were not speaking in riddles? What if they were preserving knowledge? Today we are traveling into the heart of Western Kenya to explore one of the most fascinating expressions in African cultural history. We will uncover why the Luhya people described menstruation as going to the moon, what this phrase reveals about their understanding of time, nature, and human biology, and why so much of that knowledge was misunderstood, forgotten, or dismissed during the colonial period. Along the way, we will compare similar traditions from other parts of Africa, and even from cultures separated by oceans. Some of the similarities are so striking that they raise an intriguing question. How did people who had never met arrive at remarkably similar ways of describing one of the most fundamental experiences of human life? The answer begins with the people themselves. The Luhya are one of Kenya's largest ethnic communities, made up of numerous closely related subgroups, living mainly across the fertile landscapes of Western Kenya. They speak several closely related Bantu languages and share centuries of history shaped by farming, trade, migration, and community life. Like many African societies before the arrival of clocks, calendars, and written timetables, the Luhya understood time by observing the world around them. The changing seasons, the arrival of the rains, the flowering of crops, the migration of birds, the rising and setting of familiar stars, and above all, the steady rhythm of the moon. Every month the moon appeared, grew brighter, reached fullness, faded into darkness, and returned once more. Unlike the changing weather or unpredictable harvests, its cycle was dependable. It became one of humanity's oldest calendars, guiding planting seasons, ceremonies, and the passage of time, long before mechanical clocks existed. Imagine living in a world without smartphones, watches, or printed calendars. If you wanted to know when to plant, when to harvest, when ceremonies should begin, or how many weeks had passed, you looked upward. The sky became your calendar. The moon became your clock. This was not unique to the Luhya. Across the ancient world, civilizations relied on lunar cycles to organize daily life. The earliest calendars developed in Mesopotamia followed the phases of the moon. Ancient Chinese calendars combined lunar and solar observations. Many indigenous American communities also measured time through lunar months. Even today, the Islamic calendar remains lunar. Human beings have always looked upward to understand life below. The Luhya were no exception. Within this way of understanding time, language evolved naturally. Children born during certain seasons received names that reflected the conditions surrounding their birth. Among many Luhya communities, names such as Wafula and Nafula are traditionally associated with the rainy season, while Wakesa and Nakesa are linked with the harvest period. These names were more than labels. They preserved memory. They anchored people to time, place, and community. Nature was not separate from identity. It helped define it. Seen through this lens, the expression Okutsia Kumwesi, often translated as going to the moon, begins to make far more sense. Rather than describing illness or weakness, the phrase appears to locate menstruation within the same natural rhythm that governs seasons, agriculture, and the passage of months. It framed the menstrual cycle as part of a larger pattern already visible in the heavens. This is where modern science offers an interesting perspective. The average lunar cycle lasts about 29.5 days. The average menstrual cycle is often close to 28 days. Although healthy cycles commonly range from about 21 to 35 days, and naturally vary from person to person. For generations, people noticed that both followed recurring monthly rhythms. Did ancient communities believe the moon directly caused menstruation? There is no convincing scientific evidence that it does, but that does not mean the comparison lacked meaning. Our ancestors did not need microscopes to recognize patterns. Long before anyone understood hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, or luteinizing hormone, people could observe that women experienced recurring cycles that seemed to echo the rhythm of the months. Observation came first. Scientific explanation arrived centuries later. This distinction is important because indigenous knowledge is often misunderstood. Modern discussions sometimes assume that traditional societies either possessed miraculous scientific knowledge or knew nothing at all. The historical reality is much more interesting. Communities carefully observed the natural world, recognized recurring patterns, and built practical systems around those observations. Their explanations reflected the knowledge available at the time, but the observations themselves were frequently accurate. That is one reason so many traditional societies developed sophisticated agricultural calendars long before meteorology existed. It is why skilled navigators crossed oceans before satellites. And it is why communities could recognize recurring biological rhythms long before endocrinology became a branch of medicine. The phrase "going to the moon" belongs within this tradition of observation. It was not simply a beautiful expression. It was a reminder that human life moved in cycles. But the story becomes even more remarkable. If this phrase reflected careful observation, why wasn't menstruation described openly? Why cloak it in language that sounded almost mysterious? The answer reveals something surprising about how traditional societies communicated, and it challenges one of the most common assumptions people make about indigenous cultures. That story begins with the remarkable power of a euphemism. Have you ever noticed that every society has words it chooses carefully? We soften the language around birth. We speak gently about death. We invent expressions for illness, love, and grief that carry more than their literal meaning. These are not signs that we are afraid of reality. They are signs that language serves more than one purpose. It informs, it protects, it preserves dignity. The same was true in many traditional African societies. Today, it is common to hear people claim that euphemisms surrounding menstruation existed because communities were ashamed of women or afraid to discuss the female body. While shame certainly existed in some cultures and historical periods, reducing every traditional expression to embarrassment oversimplifies a far more complex picture. Language is one of humanity's oldest technologies. Sometimes it conceals. More often, it communicates efficiently. Imagine a Luhya homestead 200 years ago. The first light of dawn spreads across the fields. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires. Children chase one another between houses, while elders prepare for another day of work. A young woman quietly speaks with her mother. There's no dramatic announcement, no lengthy explanation. A few simple words are exchanged. She has gone to the moon. Nothing more needs to be said. The phrase immediately tells those who need to know that she is experiencing her monthly cycle. It communicates the information discreetly while respecting her privacy. Everyone understands the message without forcing an intensely personal experience into public conversation. This was not silence. It was shared understanding. Across the world, communities have long developed similar forms of indirect language. In English, people often say someone has passed away rather than died. Pregnancy has been described as expecting. Illnesses have been softened with expressions intended to show compassion rather than bluntness. Indirect language is not automatically evidence of fear. Sometimes it is evidence of courtesy. Anthropologists have long recognized that euphemisms often strengthen social harmony. They allow sensitive subjects to be discussed in ways that preserve dignity, while still conveying precise meaning. The Luhya expression appears to have functioned in much the same way. Rather than defining a woman by her bleeding, it placed her experience within the larger rhythm of life itself. She had gone to the moon. The phrase sounded beautiful because it reflected something beautiful. The cycle was expected, natural, temporary, and destined to return again. It is worth remembering that pre-colonial African societies were deeply communal. Daily life unfolded in shared spaces, where privacy depended as much on mutual respect as on physical walls. In such communities, language mattered enormously. A carefully chosen phrase could protect someone's dignity while allowing practical adjustments to be made within the household. Historical evidence suggests that menstrual practices differed considerably across African societies. Some communities expected women to continue with ordinary routines. Others encouraged periods of rest or reduced workloads. In some places, older women provided guidance to younger girls entering puberty, passing on practical knowledge about fertility, hygiene, and adulthood. There was no single African tradition. The continent has always contained extraordinary cultural diversity. What united many communities was the recognition that menstruation marked an important biological rhythm, deserving acknowledgement rather than denial. This perspective becomes clearer when we examine the wider structure of indigenous knowledge. Many African societies organized life around recurring cycles: rainy seasons, harvests, livestock migrations, market days, ceremonies, initiation rites, birth, death. Everything moved according to rhythms that repeated over time. Menstruation naturally became one more rhythm within that larger pattern. To modern ears, the phrase "going to the moon" may sound mystical. To the people who used it, it may have sounded as ordinary as saying that the rains had arrived. The extraordinary became ordinary because it happened every month. This way of thinking also reminds us of something easily forgotten today. Traditional knowledge was rarely written in books. It lived in memory. It traveled through conversation. Parents taught children. Grandparents taught grandchildren. Elders taught newly married couples. Knowledge survived because people remembered stories, names, and expressions that could be recalled years later. A phrase like "okutsia kumwesi" carried far more information than its literal translation suggests. It linked biology with time, time with nature, nature with community, and community with memory. That is one reason indigenous languages deserve careful study. They often preserve ideas that cannot be translated word for word into another language without losing much of their cultural meaning. When a language disappears, dictionaries may preserve vocabulary, but they rarely preserve an entire worldview. As linguists often say, every language offers a different way of organizing reality. The Luhya language organized menstruation not as an isolated medical event, but as part of a recurring natural cycle visible in the heavens. Whether or not every family consciously thought about astronomy is almost beside the point. The metaphor itself shaped perception. It reminded people that cycles were normal, expected, and deeply connected to the world around them. Yet the Luhya were not alone. Thousands of kilometers away, other African communities developed their own ways of describing menstruation. The words differed, the ceremonies differed, the beliefs differed. But beneath those differences lay a remarkably familiar pattern. Again and again, societies connected menstruation with renewal, transformation, and the rhythms of nature, rather than treating it solely as a medical event. Could these similarities simply be coincidence? Or do they reveal something universal about the way human beings have understood the body throughout history? To answer that question, we need to leave Western Kenya and begin a journey across the African continent, where surprisingly familiar ideas appear in places separated by vast distances, different languages, and entirely different histories. And that is where this story becomes even more fascinating. If the Luhya were the only people to connect menstruation with the moon, it would be easy to dismiss the phrase as an isolated cultural curiosity. But they were not. Travel across Africa, and you begin to notice something remarkable. The languages change, the landscapes change, the kingdoms rise and fall. Yet, again and again, communities describe menstruation using symbols drawn from nature rather than disease, shame, or weakness. Not because they all shared the same beliefs, they did not, but because they were all trying to answer the same human question: how do we make sense of one of the most powerful biological rhythms in human life? The answers they developed were different, yet they often pointed in surprisingly similar directions. Among the Asante people of present-day Ghana, the arrival of a girl's first menstruation was traditionally marked through a ceremony known as bragoro. Rather than being hidden away, this transition into womanhood was publicly acknowledged. The ceremony recognized that childhood had ended and a new stage of life had begun. In historical accounts, young women participating in bragoro were treated with honor and respect. Family members gathered, elders offered guidance, songs, advice, and ritual marked the beginning of adulthood. This was not simply a biological event, it was a social milestone. The community recognized that something important had changed. Far to the south, among the Zulu of southern Africa, language surrounding menstruation also reflected cultural understandings of transition and renewal. Although translations vary and should be interpreted carefully, scholars have noted that expressions associated with cleansing and renewal appear within broader discussions of the menstrual cycle. The emphasis was not identical to that of the Luhya, nor should we expect it to be. Cultures rarely borrow ideas unchanged. Instead, each society adapted its language to reflect its own worldview, environment, and traditions. Travel westward again toward Côte d'Ivoire, and oral traditions among the Beng people include metaphors comparing fertility to the life cycle of plants. Like seeds that must flower before fruit appears, human reproduction was often explained through images drawn directly from the natural world. These comparisons remind us of something important. Before modern biology classrooms, people explained complex processes using familiar experiences. A child who understood crops could understand growth. Someone who watched flowers bloom could understand change. Nature became the first textbook. Perhaps that is why so many traditional societies reached instinctively for images of rivers, seasons, trees, stars, and the moon when describing the human body. The language made sense because everyone already understood the natural world. What is especially fascinating is that similar ideas appear far beyond Africa. Across the Pacific Ocean, among the Yurok people of Northern California, menstruation has long been associated with what English speakers often call moontime. While the cultural beliefs surrounding this expression differ significantly from those of the Luhya, the recurring association between the moon and the menstrual cycle is striking. Two societies separated by oceans, different histories, different languages, different spiritual traditions, yet both found the moon to be an appropriate symbol for recurring biological rhythms. This does not prove that one culture influenced the other, nor does it prove that the moon governs menstruation. What it demonstrates is something equally interesting. Human beings are exceptional observers. Throughout history, people looked for recurring patterns in the world around them. When they noticed that the moon followed a reliable monthly rhythm, and that women also experienced recurring monthly cycles, many naturally linked the two through language and metaphor. This is one of the defining characteristics of human culture. We understand the unknown by comparing it to what we already know. The stars became maps. Rivers became metaphors for life. Trees represented family. Fire represented transformation. And the moon became a symbol for cycles. These observations formed the foundation of stories, ceremonies, and traditions that helped communities remember important knowledge long before writing became widespread. Modern science invites us to appreciate these observations without confusing them with scientific proof. Researchers have explored possible relationships between lunar cycles and human biology for decades. Some studies have suggested weak or inconsistent associations under specific conditions, while many others have found no meaningful correlation. Today, the scientific consensus remains cautious. There is no reliable evidence that the phases of the moon directly regulate the menstrual cycle. That conclusion is important, but it should not cause us to dismiss the wisdom of earlier generations. Because the point was never that the moon caused menstruation. The point was that the moon provided one of the most visible examples of recurring change in the natural world. For people living without electric lighting, the moon was impossible to ignore. It illuminated nights, marked the passing of weeks, influenced travel, shaped agricultural activities, helped determine ceremonial calendars. Its changing appearance became one of humanity's most reliable reminders that nothing remains the same forever. Everything moves in cycles. The moon waxes, the moon wanes. The rains arrive, the rains depart. Seeds are planted, harvests are gathered, children are born, elders pass away. Life itself unfolds through rhythms that repeat without ever becoming identical. When viewed this way, the phrase "going to the moon" becomes something far richer than a euphemism. It becomes a philosophy, a reminder that change is not failure. Change is the very structure of life. Perhaps that is why so many traditional societies treated menstruation not as an interruption of life, but as one expression of life's continuing rhythm. Yet despite the elegance of these ideas, many of them would later be misunderstood. As European missionaries, colonial administrators, and early anthropologists encountered African societies during the 19th and 20th centuries, they often interpreted indigenous practices through their own cultural assumptions. Words that local communities understood one way were translated into entirely different meanings. Practices rooted in observation became labeled as superstition. Customs intended to preserve dignity became described as taboos. How did that happen? And what was lost in the process? To answer those questions, we have to examine one of the most influential chapters in Africa's intellectual history. It is a chapter that continues to shape how many people think about indigenous knowledge even today. History is rarely erased in a single moment. More often, it fades gradually. One generation forgets a story, the next forgets why the story mattered. Eventually, all that remains are fragments, repeated without understanding. That is what happened to many indigenous African knowledge systems during the colonial era. When European explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrators began documenting African societies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they encountered cultures that organized knowledge very differently from their own. Many African communities relied on oral tradition rather than written texts. Knowledge was carried by elders instead of libraries. History lived in stories. Medicine lived in practice. Astronomy lived in observation. To the people who inherited these traditions, they were perfectly logical. But to many outsiders, they appeared unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things are often misunderstandings. This is not to say that every colonial scholar dismissed African knowledge. Some ethnographers painstakingly recorded languages, customs, and oral histories that might otherwise have been lost. Their work remains invaluable to historians today. However, many early accounts were written through the cultural assumptions of their time. Victorian Europe placed enormous emphasis on modesty, sexual restraint, and rigid social expectations surrounding the body. Missionary interpretations were also shaped by particular religious traditions that often viewed indigenous rituals with suspicion. When these observers encountered African customs surrounding menstruation, they frequently interpreted them through their own cultural lenses. Practices intended to provide privacy could be described as isolation. Rituals marking maturity became evidence of superstition. Symbolic language became proof of ignorance. The meaning changed because the interpreter changed. Imagine visiting another country where everyone removes their shoes before entering a home. If you do not understand the custom, you might conclude that the people fear dirt in a way that seems excessive. Later, you discover that the practice is rooted in cleanliness, hospitality, and respect for shared living spaces. The behavior never changed, only your understanding did. Something similar happened repeatedly in colonial descriptions of African societies. Language that carried cultural meaning was translated into literal words stripped of their context. The result was often an incomplete picture. For decades, many schoolchildren learned African history through books written largely from European perspectives. Those books understandably reflected the knowledge, priorities, and assumptions of their authors. As a result, indigenous systems of agriculture, medicine, governance, and astronomy were often simplified or overlooked. Modern scholarship has been working steadily to correct that imbalance. Historians today increasingly combine archaeology, linguistics, oral traditions, ethnography, and documentary evidence to reconstruct a fuller picture of Africa's past. Rather than asking whether traditional knowledge was scientific by modern standards, researchers ask different questions. What observations were people making? How were those observations preserved? Why did communities develop particular customs? What practical purpose did they serve? These questions produce far richer answers. Take the phrase "okutsia kumwesi" once again. If we approach it expecting superstition, we are likely to find superstition. If we approach it with curiosity, we discover careful observation, cultural symbolism, and a sophisticated understanding of recurring natural rhythms. The phrase itself has not changed. Only the questions we ask of it have changed. This shift in perspective is happening across many fields of African history. Ancient ironworking techniques, once dismissed as primitive, are now recognized for their remarkable sophistication. Traditional ecological knowledge is helping scientists understand sustainable land management. Indigenous farming practices are being studied for their resilience in changing climates. Oral histories, once dismissed as legends, are increasingly being compared with archaeological discoveries, sometimes revealing surprising historical accuracy. None of this means every traditional belief was scientifically correct. No culture in human history has been right about everything. Ancient Greece was not, Imperial China was not, medieval Europe was not, pre-colonial Africa was not. Knowledge grows because people continue asking questions. The remarkable achievement of traditional societies was not that they possessed modern science before scientists. It was that they carefully observed the world around them and created systems that helped communities live, remember, and adapt. That deserves respect. Perhaps one of the greatest losses of colonization was not simply land, or political independence. It was confidence. Many Africans were taught that valuable knowledge only come from somewhere else. That wisdom traveled in one direction, that progress required forgetting rather than remembering. Today, a new generation of scholars is challenging that assumption. Across universities, museums, and research institutions, African historians, linguists, archaeologists, and anthropologists are recovering voices that were once pushed to the margins. They are not romanticizing the past, nor are they rejecting modern science. Instead, they are asking a more balanced question. What can we learn when traditional knowledge and scientific inquiry are allowed to speak to one another, instead of competing? Perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside the phrase, going to the moon. It invites us to slow down before dismissing ideas that sound unfamiliar. It reminds us that wisdom does not always arrive wearing the language of laboratories. Sometimes it arrives as a grandmother's quiet sentence, a sentence spoken so naturally that nobody thought to question it. Until now. But one important question still remains. What relevance does any of this have today? Why should a 21st century audience care about an old expression from Western Kenya? Because this story is not really about the moon. It is about the way we understand our bodies, our history, and ourselves. And that conversation has never been more important. There is a temptation whenever we study history to treat it as something safely locked away in the past. Interesting, educational, but ultimately irrelevant. We need to ask, how does this story connect to us today? The story of Okutsia Kumwesi challenges that assumption. Because this is not simply a story about what our ancestors believed. It is a story about how human beings learn. Every generation inherits knowledge in two ways. One comes from observation, the other comes from science. The greatest breakthroughs happen when the two meet. Think about it. Long before satellites existed, farmers knew when the rains were changing. Long before meteorologists issued forecasts, fishing communities could read the sea. Long before laboratories identified vitamins, communities learned which plants healed wounds and which plants caused harm. Observation came first. Scientific explanation followed. Neither replaces the other. Science explains why something happens. Observation often notices that it happens. That distinction matters. When the Luhya linked menstruation with the moon, they were not writing endocrinology textbooks. They were describing a recurring rhythm that generations had noticed through careful observation. Today we understand that the menstrual cycle is governed by an intricate conversation between the brain and the ovaries. Hormones such as gonadotropin-releasing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, and progesterone work together in a carefully regulated cycle that prepares the body for possible pregnancy each month. Modern medicine has revealed details that our ancestors could never have known. And yet, modern medicine has also confirmed something they observed correctly. The menstrual cycle is not random. It is rhythmic. It follows patterns. It changes over time. And it reflects the extraordinary complexity of the human body. That realization should inspire humility. Not because ancient communities knew everything, clearly they did not, but because they understood the importance of paying attention. In a world filled with smartphones, wearable devices, and health apps, we often forget that the first tool for understanding the body was simple observation. People noticed, they remembered, they compared, they learned. Today, millions of women use digital applications to track their menstrual cycles. They record symptoms, mood, energy levels, sleep, pain, fertility. These apps use algorithms rather than oral tradition, smartphones instead of memory. Yet the underlying principle remains remarkably familiar. Observe the pattern, learn the rhythm, understand the cycle. In many ways, technology is helping us rediscover something our ancestors never forgot. The body speaks in patterns. Perhaps the greatest difference is that modern science now gives us the ability to explain those patterns with extraordinary precision. We know why ovulation occurs. We understand hormonal feedback systems. We can diagnose conditions such as endometriosis and polycystic ovary syndrome with increasing accuracy. We have knowledge that previous generations would have considered miraculous. That progress deserves celebration, but progress should never require amnesia. Too often, societies are encouraged to choose between tradition and science as though they are enemies. They are not. Tradition asks meaningful questions. Science tests possible answers. One preserves memory, the other expands understanding. Together, they help us build a fuller picture of what it means to be human. Perhaps that is why expressions like Okutsia humwesi still deserve our attention. Not because they replace medicine, not because they prove hidden scientific theories, but because they remind us that knowledge can be preserved in stories, language, and culture, just as surely as it can be preserved in journals and textbooks. When we lose those stories, we lose more than vocabulary. We lose ways of seeing the world. We lose questions that future generations may never think to ask. Across Africa today, many indigenous languages are under pressure. As older generations pass away, countless expressions disappear with them. Some can never be translated fully because their meaning depends on centuries of shared experience. Each forgotten phrase is like a missing page from a history book. Once it disappears, recovering its original meaning becomes increasingly difficult. That is why documenting these traditions matters. Not to freeze culture in time. Culture has always evolved. Not to reject modern medicine. Modern medicine saves lives, but to ensure that future generations inherit the richness of both worlds, the wisdom of careful observation, and the power of scientific discovery, together. Because history is not something we inherit automatically. It survives only when someone chooses to remember. Perhaps that is why your grandparents' generation used phrases that younger people rarely hear today. They were not simply speaking, they were preserving memory, one conversation at a time, one generation after another. And perhaps that is exactly what we are doing together today. If this story has changed the way you think about Indigenous knowledge, then our journey does not have to end here. In my book, Lunar Mysticism, Ancient Wisdom on the Menstrual Cycle and the Art of Coming Back to Yourself, I explore these ideas in much greater depth. We examine how different civilizations understood the menstrual cycle, what modern research tells us about reproductive biology, sleep, and hormonal rhythms, and how ancient observation can exist alongside evidence-based science without confusing one for the other. If you would like to continue exploring this fascinating intersection of history, anthropology, and modern biology, you can find the link in the pinned comment below. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to BTS Africa Media, and join us as we uncover more of Africa's overlooked intellectual history. And before you leave, I would love to hear from you. Did your community have its own phrase for menstruation or other important life transitions? Share it in the comments. Every language carries a story. Every story preserves a piece of history, and together, those stories help us understand who we are. As an African proverb reminds us, a river that forgets its source eventually runs dry. Knowing where we come from does not prevent us from moving forward. It gives us a stronger foundation for the journey ahead. The moon will continue its endless journey across the night sky, growing, fading, returning, just as it has for thousands of years. Generation after generation, people have looked upward and found a way to understand life below. Perhaps that is why the old phrase has survived for so long. She has gone to the moon, not as a symbol of shame, not as a superstition, but as a quiet reminder that life itself moves in cycles. I am the Social Architect. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and never stop asking what history still has to teach us.